Likutei Sichos, Chelik Yud, Volume 10, the second sicha for Parshas Vayetzei. This is a very unique sicha, as it is actually a combination of a sicha and a maimer that the Rebbe said on this topic, on the same Shabbos. This is a Rashi sicha, and we will revisit several rules in Rashi. Number one, how Rashi, although he is exclusively Pshutei Shel Mikra, only the Pshat, but sometimes Rashi also brings from a Medrash or from a Gemara, and it's obvious that when he does so, it is essential to the Pshat, to understanding the Pshutei Shel Mikra. Another thing, we'll also see how every expression in Rashi, even the style in which he chooses to quote from his source, is also essential to his Pirush and really brings it out in a clearer manner. At the end of the Sicha, we'll also see an amazing explanation according to Chassidus, and even how it's understood on a deeper level from the words of Rashi and Rashi's choice of explanation. And this will be surrounding the topic, the idea of names. What is a name of a person? And then finally, at the end of the Sicha, the Rebbe also will connect it to the Tes and Yud Kislev celebration of the Mittler Rebbe, which is typically always within the week in which we read, in which we learn Parshas Vayetzei. So this Sikh is on the pasuk Vatahar Leah Vatelet Bein. The Leah gave birth to a son, the very first son. Vatikra Shemoy Reuven. She called his name Reuven. Ki Amra, because she said, Ki Ra Hashem be'oni. Hashem has seen my affliction. Leah felt that she wasn't so loved by Yaakov, especially in contrast to her sister Leah, to Rachel, and she concluded, Ki ata yehevani ishi, because now my husband will love me, and therefore she called his name Reuven. So Rashi quotes the words Vatikra Shemoy Reuven, and he explains, Rabbi Seinu Pirshu, our Chachamim explained that she said, see the difference between my son and the son of my father-in-law, referring to Esav. He sold his Bechorah to Yaakov. He sold his firstborn rights to Yaakov, whereas my son did not sell it to Yosef. Moreover, he did not raise any protest on the fact that Yosef got the Bechorah. And not only did he not protest, but when it came down to it, he was there to try to save Yosef's life and try to pull him out of the pit when his brothers wanted to chas v'sholom take away his life. That's what Rashi explains. So the Rebbe asks two major questions. Number one, Rashi himself underscores the fact that ani loibasi lefaresh el pshutei shel mikra, that my whole purpose is exclusively to explain Pshutei Shel Mikra, the Pshat of the Pasuk. And the question is, what needs to be explained here? Why do we even need this Rashi? The Pasuk itself seems to tell us clearly the reason why she called him Reuven. What more do we need? Number two, meaning moreover, Rashi explains that the reason for why she called him Reuven is because the contrast between my son, Reuven, see my son, see the difference between my son and my father-in-law's son, and so on. That seems to go against what the Pasuk clearly says. The Pasuk gave us a reason. In other words, it seems to contradict the Pshutei Shel Mikra. Although you can argue, well, Rashi has a source for it. This comes from the Gemara. But we know that Rashi himself tells us that he does not quote other sources. He does not venture out to quote a Medrash or a Gemara unless it's absolutely essential to Pshutei Shel Mikra. And helps or enhances Pshutei Shel Mikra. How is that the case here? Why is it necessary? Now, there are some Mefarshim that explain that what prompted Rashi to do this, why it's necessary to look for another explanation or an added explanation into why she called him Reuven, because if you look at the name Reuven, all that's explained in the Pasuk explains only a part of the name. the part that says Ru'u, see, okay? That means Yaakov will see that she had a son, and therefore, he will love her better. But it doesn't explain the second part of the name, Bain, the Bays and the Nun. Okay? That's what some Mefarshim explain. However, this cannot be the reason that prompted Rashi, says the Rebbe. The Rebbe disagrees with that reason. Why? Because according to Pshuta Shel Mikra, there is a way to understand what the Bays and the Nun represent, even if one is looking for it. Namely, the word Be'oni, in my affliction, there is a Bays and a Nun in that word. In other words, it's a partial representation of the actual reason that she's quoting for why she is happy about having the son. And even if we should argue, but it's missing the other letters, so we already have a precedent for this in an earlier Rashi in Parshas Bereshis, where Rashi explains the reason for why the heavens are called Shamayim. Rashi says because it's Eish and Mayim. Although over there, the Aleph is not represented. Not only the Aleph is not represented, but the Shin in the word Shamayim has a totally different vowel than that in the word Eish. And yet, it is fine. It is enough. It suffices of Pshuta Shel Mikra that Eish and Mayim becomes Shamayim. So therefore here too, if that was the actual cause, if that was the actual reason that prompted Rashi to explain it, to look for a deeper explanation, then Reuven should make sense according to Pshuta Shel Mikra. Then the Rebbe goes on to more questions. Number one, what is the reason she gave? What is the reason that she said? She said, look at the difference between my son and my father-in-law's son, right? That he sold the Bechorah, right? My father-in-law's son sold the Bechorah, and my son, in the contrast, my son did not, and moreover, that he didn't even protest when it was taken away from him. Number one, the Rebbe asks, this is something that's going to happen in a very distant future, and therefore it's like a distant prophecy. Actually, when did this happen? Just for clarity, this is when the story of Bilhah occurred. This is many years from this from this time that we're in right now, when he's actually being born. This is many years later when Rachel passes away and Reuven committed the sin that he committed, and Yaakov took away his Bechorah and gave it to Yosef. That's in a very distant future. Why would she quote something like that? Moreover, why would she pick something which is actually a derogatory depiction, a derogatory representation of Reuven's life? Why would she pick this to highlight his greatness? Why didn't she just say, if she was trying to contrast him against Esav, her father-in-law's firstborn, why didn't she just say Esav was a ganef? Esav was out there stealing and robbing people, whereas my son, he's not going to steal from people. As we know the story, when he found the Dudayim, and he only took something that was hefker and free for all. Why didn't she use something more positive? Then the Rebbe adds another question. If we look closely, and you actually read the Gemara, Rashi's source, over there, the Gemara doesn't really emphasize the contrast between Reuven and Esav as to how the Bechorah was given up, how the firstborn right was lost. The Gemara doesn't really go into the fact that Esav sold it, whereas Reuven didn't give it up. The Gemara goes actually into the fact, it makes a distinction that Esav hated Yaakov, whereas Reuven didn't hate Yaakov. Rashi seems to emphasize that the contrast is that Reuven did not give it up, whereas Esav did give it up. Okay? And the third question, that if Rashi is already pointing out that Reuven did not, that Reuven was not me'arer, Reuven did not contest, Reuven did not raise any objection when Yaakov took away his Bechorah, why didn't he complete that by contrasting that the Esav did contest, that Esav was angry about it? He doesn't mention that, he just leaves that out. He just mentions the fact that Reuven did not contest the fact that Yaakov took away his Bechorah. So the Rebbe says, to answer all these questions, the Rebbe gives us a clarity into the whole matter here. And the Rebbe explains as follows. That in truth, the fact that Leah is having a son now, and that she is hopeful that this fact will now change her status with her husband, meaning that it will make her husband love her more and be more affectionate and feel closer to her, that in general, I underscore, in general, is true. When a woman has a child, that in general brings a certain closeness and a certain appreciation and affection from the husband to the wife. However, in this case, in particular, that would not suffice. And that would not really be an absolute cause for Leah to really be hopeful that Yaakov will actually love her more. Why? Because recall that what is the issue here at hand? What is the matter? What is the reason that Leah feels that Yaakov feels a certain greater closeness to Rachel over her? Because Yaakov in fact did like Rachel more. And Yaakov in fact did intend to marry Rachel and have his bechor with Rachel. So therefore, the fact that she's having the son now is not enough to actually clinch this, so to speak, to make it that Yaakov should love her, while Yaakov is still hopeful to have a son from Rachel. So it cannot just be the mere fact, as it appears in the pasuk, because I gave birth to a son for him. That in itself, Rashi understands, in Pshutei Shel Mikra, is not enough to have convinced Leah that now she will be loved. Now she will be loved over Rachel. While Rachel is still there, so to speak, as a contender, as a competition, in Yaakov's mind, Yaakov wants Rachel to have the son. That's number one. And number two, just the mere fact that she gave birth to a son, to a firstborn son, is not enough to turn around Yaakov's love towards her. Why not? Because there's already a certain pattern, so to speak, in this family. Yaakov's father had also a firstborn. That guy didn't turn out too well. Yaakov's grandfather had a firstborn who also didn't turn out too well. Right? Both Yishmael and Esav didn't bring exceptional amount of nachas, to say the least, to their parents. And therefore, just the mere fact that she gave birth to the firstborn, Rashi understands in Pshutei Shel Mikra, cannot be enough of a reason for her to become now convinced that Yaakov will now love her. And therefore Rashi explains, and he brings from the Gemara. Therefore Rashi brings from the Medrash that there was more to what Leah was saying, more than just the words that appear in the pasuk itself clearly. In other words, Rashi says it's essential for Pshutei Shel Mikra to understand that there was a lot more to this thinking than just the words that appear in the pasuk. And that's why she says, it's almost as if the pasuk itself is calling out. The Pshutei Shel Mikra itself is demanding a drash. The Pshutei Shel Mikra itself demands an expansion of what actually says in the pasuk. And therefore, she brings the point. Therefore, Rashi doesn't even quote the whole Gemara and everything exactly the way it appears in the Gemara. Therefore, Rashi says that he did not sell it. Whereas his uncle, the firstborn of Yitzchak, did sell it. Why does Rashi highlight this point versus the other points that the Gemara says? Or that this point the Gemara doesn't even really say? Because this is the whole point. What Leah is saying is, look here, I now gave birth to the first son. To him, this is going to be an extremely important thing. He is the first son of Yaakov. The Bechorahud, the firstbornhood, is going to be something of great value to Reuven, which he will never willingly give up. He will never sell it. In contrast to Esav, who just gave it up. He didn't care. It didn't mean anything to him. He just gave it up so callously. My son will never give it up. He will not sell it for anything. And yet, although he will not sell it for anything, although this means so much to him, but when it comes to it and Yaakov takes it away from him for whatever reason, and Yaakov gives it and transfers it to another son, to Yosef, to the firstborn of Rachel, even so he will not protest, even so he will not raise any contest to it. He will not make a big deal out of it. And not only that, but furthermore, he is going to try and save Yosef, although his bechorah was taken away from him, something that's so precious to him, and giving to Yosef. With this, she was emphasizing of how special this son is, and how much this son should be loved, how much the son should bring her love from Yaakov, because this son is so special, the fact that he's being born now, and that he is going to cherish the fact that he was born first. And again, I repeat, even though he will lose that right later on, yet he will still not lose his character. He will still not lose his edelkeit, his refinement. And this is the reason that he's a cause of tremendous nachas to Yaakov, and therefore Yaakov should love him now. And this also can help explain why she didn't contrast the fact that he will not protest, to contrast it with the fact that Esav did protest. Because her objective here was not to show how Reuven is better than Esav, how Reuven contrasts Esav per se, but rather her point was to bring out, to highlight how great Reuven is, and how much the bechorah means to him, and yet what kind of a mensch he is, and what kind of mensch he's going to be even when he loses the bechorah. And with this we can also understand another very interesting nuance in Rashi. Typically when Rashi quotes Chazal, he says, Omru Rabbeinu, our sages said. Over here he doesn't use that expression. He says Rabbeinu Pirshu, our rabbis, our sages explained. What's the difference? The difference is if you say Omru Rabbeinu, it's almost like saying you can't understand the pasuk as it is. You cannot take it, so to speak, at face value. You need to have what the sages say. They change the appearance, so to speak. Over here, however, what Rashi really did, and this really, so to speak, galvanizes what the Rebbe is explaining in Rashi, he doesn't change the pasuk. He doesn't take away from the reason that's brought in the pasuk. He rather expounds it and explains how Rivka was convinced. This is an explanation. How she was so convinced that this will actually help her clinch the love that she's looking for from Yaakov. And with this, the Rebbe goes over to Yeno Shel Torah. You know, in every Rashi, there is the wine, there is the deeper secrets in the Rashi. And in order to get to the Rebbe brings from Chassidus, and I'll try to do justice to it, in short. And the Rebbe explains that if we actually look at a very interesting phenomena, which in this parsha plays out very much, we'll see an interesting contrast between the names of the Avos, Avrohom, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the names of all the Shvatim. Number one, the names of the Shvatim were given by their mothers, all of them. The names of the Avos, the pasuk doesn't even clearly say who gave the name. It's hinted sometimes that Hashem gave the name, or we see by Avrohom, Hashem told him to call Yitzchak, but it wasn't even given, certainly not by the mothers, maybe not even by the fathers. It was already decided by Hashem himself. By the Shvatim, it was the mothers who gave the name. Another thing, by the Avos, it doesn't always explicitly explain, it doesn't explicitly say the reason for the name. It is definitely implied, but the pasuk doesn't make a point to say, quote, al shem, therefore she called him Reuven. But in the case of the Shvatim, it always says it as a reason. For example, here it says she called him Reuven because she said such and such. Interesting, contrast between the two. What does this bring out? What does this really mean? So the Rebbe says to understand this, we first need to, al pi Chassidus, understand the idea of a name. In general, what is a name? A name, as explained in Chassidus, the name of a person, the name of a thing, actually connects and brings out the essence of the thing. It brings out the essence of that particular thing. For example, the Alter Rebbe makes a statement that a neshama, before it connects to a body, it doesn't have a name. It doesn't need a name. It's only the neshama as it comes into the body, it has a name. But even there's almost like, there's two aspects to the name. You have the general aspect, and then you have the particular aspect. When neshama connects to a body, you have in general, this now is called an Adam, a human being. That's a very general name. It's an essential thing. It's alive. It's a live human being. But then you have the particular name, that particular person, which really brings out the relationship of that neshama and that guf, that soul and that body, and as it will function, its characteristics and so on and so forth throughout its life. So going back to the avos versus the shvatim, the avos in general, they are generally connected to every single yid. The avos, it's like a general name. Where do we see it? We see it in our day-to-day davening. Every time we daven, we say Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu, Elokei Avrohom, Elokei Yitzchak Yaakov. We never mention Elokei Avrohom, Elokei Shimon, Elokei Levi. Why not? Because the idea behind it, as explained in Chassidus, is that the three Avos, Avrohom, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, are dominant in the essence of every single yid. Every single yid is connected to the Avos. Every single yid has the aspect of the Avos, regardless of who the yid is, from the greatest Jew to the simplest Jew. However, in the particular avodah of every Jew, in other words, in the particular expression in the character of every Jew, everyone's different. Every Jew is different. Where do you see that? One yid is more like Reuven, one yid has the aspect of Shimon, and so on. In other words, if we would compare this in general to the relationship of a child to the father or mother, the father is like a very, very general, a very deep, essential connection to the child. But where is the true development of the child, the true character of the child that comes out? That only happens by the process of pregnancy, going through the mother and being developed within the mother's womb, and that's when a whole functioning child and later a person comes out. And that's why indeed you find that in many ways there's a stronger bond between a child and the mother because his actual development came from the mother. Thus, when it comes to the shvatim, which is, like we said, the particular expression of characteristic, the particular, so to speak, details of every given person, and in this case, beginning with the shvatim, that expression is, so to speak, a developed one. That is already a developed characteristic. That comes from the mother. And that has a particular reason, because it connects to that particular expression. This particular shevet is called by this name, and therefore the person who carries that characteristic has that particular name, so to speak, and that is something which comes more from the feminine aspect. And this can also help us understand something, and why Rashi has to go into the whole explanation on Reuven's name. You see, there's a very, very general question that can be asked here. Really? The Imahos called their sons, the Leah and Rachel, called their children in accordance with that child's particular characteristic to express their personality? Well, it doesn't seem so. Because if you look in the Pasuk, at least the way it appears in the Psukim, it always seems that the reason they gave the child that particular name is because something that happened to them, something that affected them. For example, here in Reuven, the way it appears in the Pasuk, it seems to be that Leah was happy about what's going to be now with her and her relationship with Yaakov, and therefore she called him Reuven. So how does that explain what we just said, according to Chassidus, that it's really about the characteristic, it's really about the personality, it's a representation of who Reuven is. Therefore, according to Yener Shel Torah, Rashi had to go into all this detail to tell us, no, it's not about her thinking that she's going to get love, but it's about her thinking that she's going to be loved because of the characteristic. And he goes into the details of the characteristic and the personality of who Reuven is. And says the Rebbe, according to this, we can also understand something that occurs in almost every single year, and that is that Tes and Yud Kislev, which is connected to the Mitler Rebbe, the birthday, the Yartzeit, and also the Chag HaGeula of the Mitler Rebbe, always coincides with Parshas Vayetzei. Typically, it's in the week; it's right in the middle of the week of Parshas Vayetzei. What is that? We know that in general it's explained that the difference between the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe is the Alter Rebbe is representation of the aspect of Chachma, which is really which is really like the seminal seed of everything, right? Chachma. The Mittler Rebbe, he is known to be more, so to speak, what would be represented in the feminine aspect, namely Bina. It expounds. And we actually see it in their work. Whereas the Alter Rebbe had many, many Maimorim and revealed many, many secrets of Chassidus. But the Mittler Rebbe was extraordinarily deep and in the depth and the breadth of how he explained and expounded on his father's Chassidus. In fact, the Mittler Rebbe is the one who really brought the Chassidus down into the reality of each and every one. So to speak, like calling it in, bringing it into the character of everyone. And in fact, we see that because of the way he explained Chassidus and expounded on Chassidus, he brought it to a point where, like the Mittler Rebbe said, that his wish is, and if he had that wish, obviously it was realistic, he had reasons to expect it, that when two Jungelite meet, what is going to be their discussion? What are they going to talk about? Not about the weather and not about the politics, but what they're going to talk about is Arich and Atik. Some of the most abstract concepts in Chassidus. Because his thing was to bring it down to their reality, to bring it down into a developed reality of theirs. And that's the connection to this, almost like the mother is calling the name.